To the parents, he was just a kind old man with a cane. But to Ranger, he was a predator, hiding in plain sight. And what spilled out of that cane will make your heart stop. The sun stretched long shadows across the Oakridge playground, painting the slide in gold and making the swings creak softly in the breeze. Laughter echoed as children chased each other in circles, their sneakers kicking up bits of mulch. Parents sat on benches nearby, sipping coffee and talking about work and weekend plans. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that felt safe. The kind where no one thought twice about the old man sitting alone at the far bench, cane propped against his leg, a faint smile on his wrinkled face. No one but Ranger. The German shepherd sat stiff at Claire's side, his ears twitching, his chest rising in short, sharp breaths. At first she thought it was just a squirrel, or maybe the scent of hot dogs from the vendor cart. But then his body tensed in that way she knew too well. Ranger was no ordinary pet. He was a canine, trained to track, to alert, to protect. He had pulled children from basements, found missing people in storms, and exposed things most would rather keep buried. Now his amber eyes were locked on the old man like a laser. Claire followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual. The man looked harmless, his gray hair combed back, a cap tilted slightly on his head. He was watching the children with what seemed like warmth, smiling faintly when one girl squealed on the merry-go round. He tapped his cane gently against the ground, almost in rhythm with the swing chains clinking. Claire tried to ease Ranger with a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "Easy, boy. It's fine." But it wasn't fine, not to Ranger. His nose twitched, his lips curled slightly, a low growl rolling from his throat. Some of the parents glanced over at the sound. One laughed nervously, muttering something about dogs not liking old men with sticks. The old man chuckled too, raising his hand in a wave, almost as if to say, "See? Nothing to worry about." But Ranger's body grew rigid, his paws digging into the dirt. Claire could feel the leash tighten in her grip. She tried again to calm him, but then the old man shifted his cane and Ranger snapped. It wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was the precise strike of a dog who knew exactly what he wanted. He lunged forward, teeth not for flesh but for the cane itself. The wood clattered against the bench, and for a heartbeat, the entire playground froze. Children stopped mid, laugh, parents gasped, and Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. The old man's smile faltered, his hand jerking back from the cane with surprising speed. Ranger's growl deepened as he pawed at the fallen object, his nose shoving against it like he was trying to tear it apart. Claire yanked the leash, shouting, "Ranger, heel!" But the dog ignored her command for the first time in months. His instincts were louder than her voice. She reached down and grabbed the cane, intending to return it, but the moment her fingers closed around the wood, she felt it. It was heavier than it should have been, the weight off, the balance wrong. Ranger barked sharply, eyes burning into hers as if demanding she notice. And in that instant Claire realized, this was not just a cane. The cane hit the ground with a crack that echoed across the playground, and for a second the sound seemed louder than the children's screams. Splinters flew out, the polished wood splitting like cheap glass. But what spilled from inside was not wood at all. A hollow tube rolled free, clinking against the pavement, and from its broken seams slid a line of objects that froze every parent in place. Small glass vials rattled across the ground, some filled with liquid, others with powder. A bundle of rolled papers slid out, bound tight with a rubber band. A tiny flash drive skittered across the dirt until Ranger pinned it with his paw, growling deep in his chest. The children closest to the scene stopped and stared, their eyes wide, their laughter gone. Then the panic hit. Mothers pulled their children close, fathers shouted for everyone to back away, and the air was filled with the sharp edge of fear. Claire's heart slammed against her ribs as she bent down to scoop up the pieces. The old man did not look surprised, nor did he fumble with age. His trembling stopped, his hunched shoulders straightened, And in place of the gentle grandfather the town thought they knew, stood a man with eyes cold and sharp as knives. He met Claire's gaze, and a slow smile curled at the corner of his lips. A smile that carried no warmth, only menace. Claire's stomach twisted. Ranger's growl grew louder, vibrating like a warning bell that no one could ignore. Someone yelled to call the police, but even before the words finished, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the playground. Men in plain jackets jumped out, weapons drawn, and the old man raised his hands like he had expected it. He did not fight, did not plead, he just let them pull his arms behind his back and snap on the cuffs, as if this was all a game he had already planned for. Parents clutched their children and ran from the park, while others pulled out phones, filming as chaos unfolded. Claire stepped back, clutching the cane's remains, her pulse racing. The old man glanced at Ranger one last time, his smile hardening into something more dangerous. It was the kind of look that made her skin crawl, like a warning that this was not the end but only the beginning. Within minutes another vehicle pulled up, this one marked with the seal of the FBI. A tall woman in a dark windbreaker climbed out, her auburn hair damp with sweat from the rush, her badge flashing in the late afternoon sun. She surveyed the scene quickly, her sharp eyes taking in the shattered cane, the scattered contents, the old man in cuffs, and the dog standing guard over the flash drive like it was the most precious thing in the world. She crouched down, picking up one of the vials between gloved fingers, and frowned. "The dog's right," she muttered, under her breath, almost to herself. Then louder, with the weight of certainty, she said, "This isn't just a cane, it's a key." The name came back from the database within the hour, and when Claire heard it, it carried no weight. Victor Hale, 70 years old. Decorated veteran. A familiar face at Sunday services. The kind of man neighbors waved to without thinking. He had a reputation for generosity, always helping carry groceries for the widows on his street, always bringing candy for the kids at church picnics. To Oakridge, he was harmless. A piece of furniture in the small town's routine, someone everyone trusted without question. But to the FBI, the name dropped like a stone in deep water. He wasn't harmless. He wasn't forgotten. He had been a ghost on their watch list for decades. Reynolds stood in front of the shattered cane spread across a table in the field office, her jaw tight as she flipped through the thin file that had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention. "Victor Hale," she repeated, as if saying it would make the reality settle faster. She tapped the papers with her pen, eyes narrowing. He disappeared from radar in the late 90s, popped up under different names in different cities, always near youth programs or adoption agencies, then vanished again. We knew he was working for someone bigger, but he always slipped away. She lifted her gaze to Claire, her voice low. "And today, he was sitting in your playground, watching children." Claire felt her throat tighten. She couldn't shake the picture of him on that bench, smiling faintly, his hand patting the cane in rhythm with the swing chains. To everyone else it had looked like the absent-minded charm of an old man, but now she replayed it in her mind, and it made her stomach twist. He hadn't been enjoying the sunlight. He hadn't been reminiscing. He had been scouting, marking, selecting. The thought of his eyes following each child made her skin crawl. Ranger paced in the corner of the room, restless, his nose still twitching at the lingering scent of the cane and its contents. Every few seconds he growled low, like he could smell the weight of secrets no one else could see. Claire crouched beside him, her hand brushing his fur, grounding herself in the solid warmth of the dog. "You knew," she whispered, "more to him than anyone else. You knew something was wrong before I even saw it." Reynolds snapped the file shut. "That cane wasn't just a walking stick," she said, her voice clipped. "It was a courier device. Messages, records, orders, all hidden in plain sight. He was moving information right under our noses, passing it like an old man passing the time. And every time he smiled at a child, every time he tapped that cane, it wasn't habit, it was signal." She looked at the pile of vials, flash drives, and papers again. This wasn't random. This was routine. Claire pressed her lips together, bile rising in her throat. She looked back at Ranger, who stared at her with steady amber eyes. The world saw a harmless grandpa. The dog saw the truth. And now, so did she. The cane sat on the metal table under harsh fluorescent light. No longer the harmless prop of a kindly old man, but a vessel that held secrets darker than anyone wanted to imagine. Forensic techs worked carefully, gloved hands steady as they pried open the hollow sections hidden inside the polished frame. One by one, items were laid out in neat rows, each one more chilling than the last. Rolled slips of paper unfurled to reveal lists of names, first names only, paired with dates and numbers that made no immediate sense, but carried a weight Claire felt in her bones. Manila envelopes tucked deep inside held copies of adoption records, official seals stamped across them. But something about the documents was wrong. The ink smudged in places, the signatures too neat, the addresses leading to places no one could find on a map. Then came the small flash drives, each one marked with tiny dots of paint, like a code meant for someone else to understand. Claire's heart dropped lower with each item pulled free, the air in the room growing heavier until she had to steady herself against the back of a chair. She was used to evidence, used to seeing things that made her sick, but this felt different. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't distant. She could picture the children who belonged to those names, children who laughed and played at the very same park where Victor Hale had been sitting just hours before. She thought of Emma, the girl she once saw crying outside the station when her friend went missing, and her chest tightened with rage. Ranger paced along the table's edge, his nose low, nostrils flaring. Each time the cane was shifted or one of its hidden pieces was handled, he growled deep in his chest. His hackles lifted, and his paws scraped against the floor, as though he wanted to drag the objects away from human hands. Claire bent down, resting a calming hand on his back, but the tremor in his muscles told her this was more than instinct. He wasn't warning them of danger in the moment. He was remembering something his nose could not forget. Reynolds leaned closer, watching the dog with a look that wasn't skepticism, but respect. "He's telling us where it's been," she said, her voice low but certain. "That scent he keeps catching, it's not just chemical residue. It's connected to the places he knows, places he's been before. He's trying to tell us more than we can see." The techs glanced at one another, uneasy but silent. Claire followed Ranger's eyes as he fixated on the vials. A faint smell of bleach drifted up when the seal cracked open, but beneath it was something sharper, something bitter that caught in her throat. Ranger sneezed once, then barked sharply, a single sound that made everyone flinch. Claire whispered to him, "What did you find, boy?" But deep down, she already knew the answer. The cane wasn't just a hiding place. It was a trail, and Ranger had already started to follow it. The house was quiet, but Ranger was not. Claire had fed him, brushed him down, even left the back door cracked so he could wander the yard, but nothing helped. He paced the living room, nails clicking against the floorboards, pausing only to press his nose against the front door. His breath fogged the glass, ears twitching toward sounds only he seemed to hear. Claire sat on the couch with her head in her hands, exhaustion tugging at her body after the day's chaos, but the dog's unease kept her from closing her eyes. Every time she thought he might settle, he circled back, claws scraping at the door again, a low whine in his throat that turned into a growl when she tried to ignore it. Finally, she pushed herself up, grabbing the leash from its hook. "All right, you stubborn thing," she muttered, clipping it to his collar. "Show me what's got you worked up." The moment the clasp clicked, Ranger surged forward, muscles straining, almost dragging her down the steps. Claire tightened her grip, her boots stumbling to keep pace, and they disappeared into the dark streets of Oakridge. The town felt different at night. The cheerful playground where the cane had broken apart was now deserted, swings creaking faintly in the wind. Storefronts glowed with dim security lights, their glass reflecting her and the dog in fleeting fragments. Ranger didn't pause to look at any of it. His nose hovered just above the ground, his breathing heavy, pulling Claire block after block with a certainty that rattled her nerves. He wasn't wandering, he was following something. A trail too faint for her to imagine, but sharp as fire to him. They reached the river before she realized how far they'd gone. The air was colder there, damp with the smell of algae and rust, and the sound of water lapping against the docks echoed in the stillness. Ranger's pace slowed only slightly before he turned sharply, hauling her toward a wide structure crouched against the bank. The warehouse loomed above them, windows dark, its rusted doors chained shut. A faded sign leaned half-broken against the wall, the letters so worn they were barely legible. It looked abandoned, but Ranger's growl cut through the quiet like a blade. He pulled her closer until they stood in front of the doors. His body lowered, hackles raised, the sound rising in his chest not out of fear but out of recognition. Claire's pulse quickened. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her voice shaking but firm as she pressed a number she knew by heart. When Reynolds answered, Claire's eyes stayed locked on the dog. "He's on to something," she said, barely above a whisper. Ranger pressed his nose to the seam of the warehouse door, inhaled deeply, then snarled. Claire felt the vibration travel up the leash and into her hand. She didn't know what was waiting inside, but Ranger did, and he wasn't about to let it hide. The sun was barely rising when the first FBI trucks rolled into the lot by the river. The air was damp with fog, the warehouse hulking in the half-light like some rusted giant. Claire stood with Ranger at her side, his body tense, eyes sharp, every muscle straining against the leash. Agents moved into position, weapons ready, their boots crunching against gravel. Reynolds gave a short signal with her hand, and in one loud motion the chains on the door were cut, and the team poured inside. The air in the warehouse hit like a wave, thick with dust and the sharp tang of chemicals. For a moment it seemed like nothing more than an abandoned building, stacks of crates rising in towers, the echo of footsteps bouncing off concrete walls. Then one of the agents pried open a crate with a crowbar, and what spilled out was not medical supplies but stacks of forged passports. Another crate was filled with blank adoption forms, fake birth certificates, and photos clipped to files. Someone gasped, and the sound carried through the silence. Claire followed as Ranger pulled forward, his nose low, weaving between the crates with a purpose that no one doubted now. The dog led them past pallets wrapped in plastic and shelves lined with boxes labeled as vaccines. An agent cracked one open, and inside were no vials, only papers bundled in string. Ranger ignored it all, his ears twitching, his pace quickening, as if something deeper inside the shadows called to him. They came upon a row of cages, stacked too high, their doors open, the metal cold and rusting. Inside lay thin blankets, scraps of clothing, and scattered toys, a stuffed bear with one ear missing, a plastic truck with its wheels cracked. Claire froze, her hand tightening on the leash until her knuckles turned white. These weren't cages for animals, they were cages for children. Empty now, but their presence screamed louder than any voice could. Ranger whined, his nose pressed against the bars, then barked, sharp and angry, before pulling her onward. The dog dragged them past the cages and down a narrow hallway, the air growing colder, the light dimmer. His growl deepened, reverberating off the walls as he reached the end of the hall where a single office door stood locked. He pawed at it, claws scraping wood, body lunging forward with desperation. Claire dropped to one knee beside him, feeling the urgency in his movements. He was frantic, more than he had been at the playground, more than at the cane. Something was behind that door. Reynolds stepped forward, her voice steady, but her eyes tight. "Get it open." A battering ram was brought in, the first strike rattling the hinges, the second splintering the frame. Ranger barked with each hit, his voice fierce, his whole body alive with determination. When the door finally gave way, splinters flying, The agent surged inside. Claire held her breath, and Ranger pulled free into the dark, leading them into whatever secret the old man had tried so hard to keep hidden. The office smelled different from the rest of the warehouse, less of dust and rust, more of stale paper and cold metal. The blinds were drawn tight over grimy windows, and the air felt trapped, heavy with secrets. A single desk stood in the middle, its surface cluttered with yellowed folders, a lamp without a bulb, and an ashtray filled with long, cold cigarette butts. The agents fanned out quickly, sweeping corners, opening drawers, photographing every detail. Claire stayed close to the doorway, her hand gripping Ranger's leash, as the German shepherd moved with sharp intent. His nose skimmed the surface of the desk, then pressed lower, paws scraping at the wood with quick, urgent strikes. "Something's here," Claire said, her voice catching. One of the agents crouched, running a flashlight along the underside of the desk. At first it looked solid, but when he tapped it, the sound came back hollow. He reached for a crowbar, wedged it against the seam, and pried. The wood gave with a groan, revealing a false bottom that had hidden its contents for who knew how many years. Inside lay a thick ledger, the leather cover cracked and worn, its pages bulging with the weight of secrets. Reynolds pulled on gloves before lifting it out, her face grim as she flipped it open. The handwriting was cramped and deliberate, page after page of dates, initials, and coded notes. But even to untrained eyes the pattern was clear. Cities, ages, prices, routes that stretched across states, lines that linked one small town to the next like veins of something rotten running beneath the country. Photos slipped from between the pages, spilling onto the floor in a grim cascade. Children stared back at them, frozen smiles from school portraits, candid shots in parks, some no older than 4 or 5. Claire's knees weakened as she sank against the wall, her breath shallow. Each photograph carried a name written in that same tight script, many of them already crossed out. She whispered, barely able to hear her own voice. He wasn't just playing grandpa, he was hunting. The room fell silent, broken only by the shuffle of pages and the faint whine rising in Ranger's throat. He nosed deeper into the desk, pressing against another seam. An agent pulled more files from a second compartment, photographs in envelopes, adoption records marked with fake seals, receipts tied to bank accounts in places no one in Oakridge had ever heard of. Reynolds stared at the growing pile, her jaw tight. "This isn't just a small-town operation," she said quietly. "This connects cities up and down the coast." He wasn't acting alone. He was a node in something bigger. Claire lifted one of the photographs with shaking hands. It was a boy she recognized. His picture once pinned to the missing persons board at the station. His eyes bright with the innocence of someone who still believed the world was safe. Her chest ached as she looked at Ranger, who stood like a sentinel over the evidence. His growl low but steady, as if daring anyone to doubt what he had found. The news broke before the sun had fully risen, and by the time morning coffee was poured across Oakridge, the entire town knew. The man they had called Grandpa Hale, the man who had handed out lollipops at the church steps and sat quietly at town meetings, had been arrested and accused of crimes too dark for anyone to say out loud without their voice breaking. The words ran across headlines, the ledger's existence whispered about in grocery store aisles, and suddenly every parent held their children tighter, watching shadows where none had been before. School buses rolled through streets half empty, because mothers and fathers kept their kids home, unwilling to let them out of sight, even for a few hours. On porches and sidewalks, neighbors gathered in tense clusters, voices raised, some shouting that there had been a mistake, that Victor Hale had been a kind soul, a veteran who deserved respect, not suspicion. They spoke of his charity work, his quiet presence at funerals, the way he once shoveled snow for Mrs. Danner when her hip gave out. Others snapped back with fury, pointing at the evidence, the ledger, the photographs of children that no amount of kindness could excuse. The town was splitting down the middle, not because the facts weren't there, but because it was easier to cling to the lie of a gentle grandfather than to accept the monster who had lived among them for decades. Claire found herself at the center of it all when she walked into the local diner to grab a coffee, and the chatter fell silent. Faces turned, some with gratitude, some with open hostility. One man stood up, his jaw tight, accusing her of dragging Hale's name through the mud. He claimed she had let her dog overreact, that she and the FBI were making something out of nothing. Claire's throat tightened, but she held her ground, remembering Ranger's bark, the weight of the photos in her hands, the names of children who would never come home. She said nothing, only rested a hand on the German Shepherd's shoulder. Ranger stood tall beside her, his eyes fixed and unwavering, as if daring anyone to deny what he had uncovered. Whispers followed her through town. Mothers thanked her in hushed tones while others crossed the street to avoid her. She had never felt so isolated, torn between relief that the truth was out and the sting of being blamed for tearing down a figure the town had idolized. That night she sat on her porch, Ranger at her feet, his head resting on his paws, amber eyes glowing in the dim light. The dog didn't care about gossip, didn't care about reputations. He had smelled what no one else could, and refused to look away. Claire looked down at him, her chest heavy but steady, and whispered, "You knew all along." Ranger lifted his head at her voice, ears flicking, his gaze steady. A silent reminder that truth mattered more than comfort, no matter how much the town wanted to close its eyes. The flash drive was small enough to lose in a pocket, nothing more than a sliver of plastic and metal, but when the analysts finally cracked its encryption, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. Screens lit up with lines of messages, spreadsheets of names, and financial records that reached far beyond Oakridge. Claire stood behind the rows of monitors, her arms folded tightly across her chest, trying to understand the enormity of what scrolled past. These weren't the acts of a single man with a twisted hobby. This was an organized machine, funded and protected by people with influence, people whose names appeared in newspapers as philanthropists and benefactors. Reynolds leaned over one analyst's shoulder, her jaw tightening with every new detail. She read the names of donors who had hosted charity galas, officials who had spoken about protecting children in front of cameras, businessmen who posed with oversized checks in photo ops. Yet here they were, trading coded emails with Victor Hale, shifting money through offshore accounts, discussing shipments and deliveries in terms that sent chills down Claire's spine. Reynolds whispered under her breath, almost too low to hear, "This is bigger than Oakridge. Much bigger." Claire felt her stomach twist. She thought of the neighbors who had defended Hale, the way they clung to the illusion of a kind old man, and realized the illusion had stretched far beyond her town. The whole network depended on masks, grandfathers, philanthropists, officials, all wearing smiles while they hunted children. Her hand tightened on Ranger's leash, grounding herself with the steady strength of the dog pressed against her leg. On the central table lay a large map spread out under the glow of a desk lamp. Red circles had been drawn around towns, blue lines connected them like veins, and sticky notes marked dates of suspicious events. The analysts pored over it, with pens in hand, muttering about timelines and connections. Ranger shifted suddenly, pulling against the leash until Claire let him step forward. His nose pressed against the paper, sniffing with quick bursts of breath, his body tense. Then he barked once, loud and sharp, startling everyone in the room. Claire knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, watching as his nose touched a specific circle near the edge of the map. Reynolds leaned closer and read the label aloud. It was an amusement park scheduled to host a children's festival that coming weekend. The room went still. Reynolds straightened, her eyes narrowing as she pieced it together. "He wasn't just watching the playground," she said. "He was planning the next move. That cane wasn't only carrying records, it was carrying orders." She looked around the room, her voice hardening into command. "We move on this now." Ranger gave another low bark, tail stiff, eyes locked on the circle. He didn't know about politics or philanthropy, but he knew danger, and he knew children were at the heart of it. His nose had found the trail again, and this time, the path led straight to a carnival of lights, hiding something darker beneath. The amusement park looked ghostly in the half-light before dawn, the bright colors of its rides muted by fog, and the silence eerie without the laughter of children. The Ferris wheel loomed like a giant skeleton against the gray sky, its seats swaying gently in the breeze. The FBI moved in quiet lines across the empty parking lot, their dark jackets blending into the shadows, their boots silent against the cracked asphalt. Claire walked with them, Ranger at her side, his ears pricked, body taut with purpose. This was not the place of joy it pretended to be, not today. And the dog seemed to feel the weight of that truth as much as anyone. Reynolds gave the signal, and agents fanned out, sweeping the park with precision. They checked food stands, prize booths, and shuttered arcades, but Ranger pulled Claire past them all, his nose locked on something stronger. He led her through the empty midway, past a row of silent roller coaster cars, toward the carousel at the center of the grounds. The painted horses, chipped and weathered, stared with glassy eyes as Ranger barked sharply, circling the platform with growing urgency. Claire's breath caught as she realized what he was telling them. "It's here," she whispered, and Reynolds ordered her team forward. The carousel floor groaned under their weight as they pried back panels. Beneath the faded paint and wooden boards, a hollow echoed. One agent struck hard with a crowbar, the wood splitting open to reveal a dark shaft hidden beneath the ride. A rush of damp air spilled out, carrying the sour smell of mildew and sweat. Ranger lunged forward, barking into the opening, claws scraping the boards as if he wanted to go down himself. Flashlights pierced the darkness, and the outline of a ladder appeared. The first agents descended, weapons ready, their voices low and steady over radios. Claire held tight to Ranger, her heart pounding, until the all-clear came from below. She followed, her boots slipping on the damp rungs as they descended into the earth. At the bottom, the tunnel stretched forward, walls lined with crude support beams, the floor packed with dirt. Ranger sniffed along the edges, growling as the passage widened into a bunker. Inside were rows of crates stacked high, marked with false labels that meant nothing once the lids were pried open. Instead of food or supplies, the boxes contained bedding, clothing in children's sizes, and notebooks filled with strange codes. Against one wall lay sleeping mats, still indented as if they had been used only days before. Recording equipment sat on a table, cameras and microphones, their wires trailing into the shadows. The silence of the place pressed heavy on everyone, broken only by Ranger's low growl as he sniffed the mats and barked once, sharp, as though demanding the agents look closer. Reynolds turned to Claire, her voice grim but certain. The cane wasn't just storage, it was a signal device. Orders passed in plain sight, hidden under the guise of an old man leaning on a stick. She glanced at Ranger, who sat tall in the center of the bunker, his eyes bright even in the dim light. And it was his nose that unlocked it all. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of smell that carried the weight of years and decisions that changed lives. Reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras flashing whenever the black van pulled up with Hale inside. Gone was the cardigan, wearing grandfather figure. Gone was the polite smile and the slow shuffle of a man pretending to be fragile. In his place stood someone thinner, harder, his eyes hollow but still carrying that edge of defiance. Shackled and dressed in the plain uniform of an inmate, he looked nothing like the neighbor Oakridge had once trusted, and yet Claire still felt a shiver crawl down her spine when his gaze flicked across the room. The trial had drawn people from across the state. Families of missing children filled the benches, their faces pale but determined. Survivors were brought in one by one, some now grown, some still young, their voices trembling as they told their stories. They spoke of being approached by a man who seemed kind, of being promised safety, of waking up in places that smelled of bleach and smoke. They spoke of fear that stretched over years, of names whispered in corridors, of friends who never came back. Every word carved into the air like a blade, and though their voices shook, they did not falter. Claire sat near the front with Ranger at her feet. The German shepherd lay calm but alert, his tail curled neatly around his side, his head high. People looked at him with gratitude, some even nodding through their tears, as if the dog himself had given them courage to speak. Ranger did not blink when Hale's lawyers tried to discredit the evidence, did not shift when the defense painted him as a confused animal acting on instinct. He simply watched, steady and silent, as though he knew the truth would stand. The turning point came when the cane itself was wheeled into the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery as agents lifted it onto the evidence table. It looked ordinary at first glance, polished wood with a curved handle, the kind of cane anyone's grandfather might use. But when the compartments were opened in front of the jury, the hollow tubes and hidden caches laid bare, the room fell into a stunned hush. The jurors leaned forward, their expressions tightening as they saw the vials, the flash drives, the papers with children's names written in cramped handwriting. It was no longer just words on a page or stories whispered in fear. It was tangible, undeniable, right there in the open. Reynolds stood at the front, her voice cutting clear. This was not a walking stick. This was a courier, a signal, a weapon disguised as something harmless. And it was trusted because he looked harmless. But he was not. She paused, letting the silence stretch. He was hunting. The jury returned quicker than anyone expected. When the word guilty echoed through the chamber, sobs broke out, and hands reached for one another. Claire closed her eyes, exhaling for the first time in what felt like years. Ranger gave a single low bark. Not loud, not fierce, just enough. It was as if he understood the fight was done. The weeks after the trial passed slowly, as if the whole town of Oakridge was learning to breathe again. The courthouse steps no longer overflowed with cameras. The whispers in the grocery store had quieted, and children returned to the playground with laughter that no longer felt edged with fear. Yet the weight of what had been uncovered lingered, heavy in the air, like a storm that had passed but left scars behind. The station became a place not just of law and order, but of memory, a reminder of the truth that one dog had pulled into the light when no one else could. On a bright morning, townsfolk gathered outside the police department, curious to see the work covered by a long white sheet stretched across the wall. Brushes and ladders still leaned nearby, paint cans half closed, the scent of fresh color mixing with the crisp air. Children tugged at their parents' hands, eager to see, while officers stood quietly in their uniforms, heads bowed in respect. Claire held Ranger's leash, her heart beating a little faster as the mayor stepped forward to speak. His words blurred in her ears, lost in the hum of her thoughts, until at last the sheet was pulled free and the mural came alive. The wall was transformed into a sweeping image of courage. Ranger stood tall in the painting, his chest proud, amber eyes sharp, his paws planted firmly on the broken cane that lay shattered beneath him. Around him were children, not faceless but painted with smiles and light, gathered as though finding safety in his presence. Above them, the sky in the mural shone bright, and beneath the scene in bold letters were words that caught in every throat. He smelled what we could not. He gave the silent their voice. A hush fell across the crowd, broken only by the sound of a child whispering, "That's him, Mama." Claire felt her chest tighten as she looked down at the real Ranger sitting calmly by her side, his ears flicking at the sound of his name. He didn't look up at the mural or seem to understand the honor being laid at his paws, but he didn't need to. He had done what no one else could, and the town would never forget. Claire knelt slowly beside him, her hands sliding along the thick fur of his neck. Her voice was low, meant only for him, yet carried in the stillness. "You didn't just sniff out a cane, Ranger. You saved every child who never got the chance to speak." Ranger turned his head, pressing his muzzle against her hand, his breath warm, his eyes steady. In that moment, no words were needed between them. The crowd began to clap, the sound swelling until it echoed down the street, but Claire heard only the soft thump of Ranger's tail against the ground. He had no need for murals or applause. His truth was simple and silent, written in every bark that had broken the quiet, in every trail his nose had followed, in every child who might now sleep safe because he had refused to look away. Thank you for watching this video of A Dog's Devotion. If you liked this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.